division. That's led by Linda Gilbert. I think quite a few of you probably know Linda as well, from her days in the natural products industry too. And then we created a market intelligence business that looks a little bit like a Nutrition Business Journal, which I was also involved in the early days. But we don't do a summit like the Newport Summit or the NBJ Summit yet. So we've processed actually nearly 1 billion transactions through our system. We've done more than 17,000 consumer surveys. And of course, consumer surveying is not terribly easy in this industry because of the different states of legalization and the willingness of people to answer questions. And so we have to have different questions for different people in different states. We're tracking now already more than 2,400 brands, and this may be a bit of a surprise, we'll talk about this, but most of the fast-growing categories in the industry are branded products. It's not just a bag of weed. And more than 140,000 different items. And the rate of progress of this industry is staggering. When I first got into the natural products industry 20 years ago, there were some moderately sophisticated packaged products, but we still had a lot of products that were in the bulk bins in natural food stores, of course. That's sort of what cannabis looked like about 4 years ago. But cannabis products now look very much like the same products that are being sold in not just natural food stores, but also in pharmacies as well. And we do in-depth custom surveys and research to understand who are these customers, what are the evolving trends, why are they consuming these products, when and how are they consuming these products. And we write books about the industry that enable people to get a better grasp for what's going on. So this is a little bit of a complicated chart. We don't need to go into very much detail about it, but you can see a trend here. You're going all the way from legalization for medical purposes in California in 1994, all the way up to the very recent evolution with adult use being approved in California, in Massachusetts, in Nevada, in Maine, and medical use in Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and more is happening. About 80% of the US population lives in a state with some sort of legal access now. And so, as you can see, the entire Pacific Coast now allows adult legal consumption. There's not very much light gray left on this chart, and you can see it's getting darker green by the minute. We've already had an interesting year with Vermont legalizing essentially, Indiana, New Jersey. New Jersey is going to go through a massive change that will influence the entire eastern seaboard quite rapidly, because New Yorkers don't like to go to New Jersey to buy their cannabis, do they? And so massive trend of development. And then globally, again, difficult to follow on this chart, but massive accelerating change. Of course, everyone's familiar with Canada's federal legalization, which will come into effect in the next few months. Germany with medical legalization. So in Germany, cannabis is reimbursable by insurance. Poland, Spain, Mexico, Uruguay, very rapid evolution around the world of legalization for medical applications, and of course in Canada's case for any adult over 19 and over. So here we're looking at a quite different situation, and in 5 years it will be very, very different. So 2018, I'm not going to really spend any time on the regulatory environment because Marielle's much more expert than me when it comes to hemp and CBD regulations, and Frank's already given you a great background. But there is so much going on in this space, and so many politicians who are evolving rapidly. They're actually going through, John Boehner, for example, has gone through what we say the average American consumer is going through, which is they've gone from no, absolutely shocking, and of course in John Boehner's, his way of putting it, there's a lot of F words thrown in there about the terrible people who consume cannabis. This is only 4 or 5 years ago. And now John Boehner is very much jumping on the financial bandwagon as a prominent board member of one of the best capitalized companies in the industry. So he went through a recognition that there is a business there, maybe actually went through a recognition that there is some science there that is very interesting as well. And there is certainly consumer demand. So here's just a few of the things that have happened in the last 5 or 6 weeks. And we heard a little bit about those. It seems to me that there is an inexorable process going on towards full legalization someday for the cannabis industry. And of course, if cannabis wasn't complicated, we're going to learn a little bit more about CBD law, which is even more complicated. So the industry is growing very rapidly. We're projecting 27% compound growth over the next 5 years. It's about a $10 billion legal industry already. But let's bear in mind that the estimates for the size of the total industry, including the gray and illegal market, puts it above 50 billion. So what we're really seeing here is the conversion of an illegal market into a regulated legal market. And so far, the regulated legal market only has about 20% of the picture. What's interesting also is, of course, in the regulated states, you see almost the elimination of the illegal market. Colorado has almost no illegal market by most standards now. So in 4 or 5 years of legalization, the industry itself has achieved what 50 years of prohibition failed to achieve. Most of the growth that I just mentioned requires no further law changes. So the voters voted and legislation is being enacted, and therefore most of this growth, only that little tiny sliver of orange at the top, is really requiring new changes. Frankly, the changes that have already happened in the last 9 months or so mean that this projection is probably on the low side. We'll be revising our projections in the next few weeks. And it used to be those core legal states. It used to be California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon. Michigan's big, but sort of unregulated up to now, but it's instituting its own regulations now. Now it's a much more diverse group of states that are driving this 40% compound growth over the last 4 years or so. As we see Nevada, Arizona, Florida starting to develop significant markets. And Massachusetts, of course, the big one so far on the East Coast. Now, this industry compares very well with some of the most spectacular growth industries in North America. Here you can see it compares well with broadband, with basic cable, with home video, for example. Industries that once they got to 5 billion, they continue to grow at a rapid rate. Frankly, this is what got me into the industry. I've never really been an advocate for cannabis. I'm an advocate for people using their brains and thinking and making smart decisions and not being restricted. But what got me into it was the inevitability of a rapid long-term growth situation. And therefore, as a businessman, I found this very appealing. Here you can see that adult use, when that comes in place, which it has now in 9 states plus DC, is a real game changer. You can see that Colorado's compound growth over 4 years now has been around 40%. Washington, very similar growth rate. Oregon, very similar growth rate as well. Now, in those states, adult use took all of the wind out of the medical markets. The medical markets in Colorado and Oregon have basically been flat ever since the adult use market started. Washington state merged the two into a single market. So there is really no separate medical market in Washington state. Now, thinking about the types of products here, and we will have a look at a few pictures in a moment, but about 50% of the market is now flower, as in bud, which is usually sold in bulk and in a glass jar, and you leave with a brown paper bag. You can see that that was about 75% of the market 4 years ago. This is Colorado, but the other mature states are seeing a very similar evolutionary pattern with regard to products. because concentrates are growing very rapidly. They're between 25 and 30% in most states now, and edible products about 15%. And then you have topicals, which represent 2 or 3% of sales, and a few other accessories and a few other products that we don't quite know how to categorize, perfectly honest. This also includes pet products in there, which might represent about 0.5% of what's sold in dispensaries. And I do want to emphasize everything I'm showing here is what is sold in a legal, regulated dispensary. We even had to change all of our data and all of our definitions with the 1st of January of this year because of California, because all of a sudden we now have a regulated market where the dispensaries have to be approved by the state. Up until then, it was a gray and confusing picture. So here you can see that flower is just not as important as it was. It has been growing, but the growth has really been driven by the concentrates emerging as the most popular products. Now, those concentrates are mainly for use with vaporizers. There are other forms of concentrates that are used in different ways, but vaporizers, especially for new adopters, have been the most popular format. And so you can see that all of these states are developing to have this kind of model of about 50% flower. Now, that means that branded products, and this was the big play for my company. You know, when we started my company 3.5 years ago, if only 20% of the market was branded and it's the brands that buy our data, then that's not a particularly attractive business model. But you can see that branded products have grown about 600% over this period, while non-branded flower has grown at about 80%. So now you understand why there are 2,300 brands already in our databases. So a little bit about the normalization of cannabis. Some of you, those of you that don't live in the legal and regulated states or don't spend much time in those states, might have thought it looks a little bit like this. This was a fairly typical dispensary in Colorado 4 or 5 years ago. In fact, it's beginning to look like this. This is Silver Peak in Aspen, one of the most luxurious boutique-like shopping experiences you could ever imagine, which is just as well because I think it's right over the road from the Four Seasons. A very high-end shopping experience. One of the issues in the industry 4 or 5 years ago was that women didn't like to go into the dispensaries, understandably. Now we're seeing that women represent about half of the shoppers, so it's evolved very rapidly to be a more comfortable shopping environment for women. And you might have thought it would look like this, as I mentioned, or maybe like this with some scrappy little packaged products at the bottom there that don't look very professional at all. But in fact, what you're seeing is this. That's what I mentioned about this very rapid evolution, because a lot of people are coming into the industry from either the natural products industry or the CPG industry. And of course, they're bringing their branding and packaging skills. And there's a lot of marketing agencies that have got into this space. And so instead of it taking 10 years to get to this, you're getting there in 2-3 years' time. We also, of course, have a lot of celebrities. I'm never sure actually whether celebrity endorsement is a successful strategy for a business, but it certainly gets you attention at some point. Actually, Marley Naturals and Willie's Reserves don't seem to have done very well as far as I can see so far. They seem to have put a lot of money into PR. Hasn't really caused them to become major players in the industry. And the product evolution is really continuing. That's another thing. There are a lot of product developers and scientists getting into this space with very credible backgrounds. And they're saying, what are the real issues? One of the issues, of course, is with edibles, the consumer doesn't know when they're going to get the effect and whether they're going to feel high or whether they're going to feel uncomfortably high. And in fact, I had an investor just last week in Vancouver, where it was legal, by the way, and this investor foolishly took 3 edibles. I didn't know he was taking 3 edibles. He said, okay, I've never tried it before, I'll take 3 edibles. Well, he threw up, he had to go to bed, he was hopeless for about 18 hours. He's still apparently an enthusiastic investor in this space, but it wasn't very bright. And the person who encouraged him is not on my top of my list at the present time. So we are seeing that people are addressing these questions of absorption and effect, and how measurable will that be and how predictable. And a major factor is very low dose products. 2.5 milligrams of THC becoming quite popular, certainly 5 milligrams. And anything over 10 milligrams is unlikely, 10 milligram becoming the established maximum on the labels typically, whether it's regulated or whether it's self-regulated. And of course, this means that there are brands everywhere. Here's just a few of the leading brands. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on THC and CBD regulation. Marielle's going to cover that much better than I could. And I don't need to go any more into what THC and cannabinoids are, because Frank gave us a nice lesson in that. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about cannabis consumers. I think this is very important. We had some slides up earlier on that showed some of the stereotypes. We've just completed a very extensive survey of cannabis consumers in North America. It's a statistically projectable study with a very robust sample, and gives us a lot of insight into who the consumers are. We've divided the states in the United States into 5 different levels of legalization, with California and Colorado being fully adult use, other states being no legal permission yet at all, or CBD only, for example. And that's important when it comes to asking those subtle questions and distinctions between them. And we also surveyed Canadian consumers separately as well. It's interesting, actually, that Canadian consumers in their thinking are a little bit less far along than American consumers. And yet, Canada has already approved federal legality. So it's an ongoing research project that we have. We started off with just the 4 main states, California, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, a little over a year ago. We surveyed about 1,000 people in each state. Now we've got an update to that so we can see the trends and changes. We've divided these consumers up into 3 different categories. Consumers who've consumed in the last 6 months, rejecters, people who have not consumed and will not consume, or are saying, no, I'm never going to be a consumer, and what we call acceptors, who are people who are not yet a consumer or may have consumed a long time ago, not in the last 6 months, and they're saying, yeah, now that things have changed, I might become a consumer at some point in the future. So, as we heard from Frank, the majority of the population agrees with some form of legalization. In the United States, about 83%. In Canada, about 84% support some kind of legalization. And you can see that similar ratio in terms of believing in medical benefits as I think we voted. Well, I can't remember what the vote was in here. It seemed like the significant majority of us felt that there might be some medical benefits to marijuana. And despite federal illegality, more than half the population has tried cannabis at some point, which was quite similar, I think, to the statistic on the people in this room as well. The majority have tried cannabis. I guess it's probably similar to these days to admitting whether you've exceeded the speed limit. People really aren't taking the federal law terribly seriously. So back to this question of consumers, acceptors, and rejectors. Here you can see a slight difference between Canada and the United States. And in Canada, we're talking about adults 19 and over instead of 21 and over. But you can see that about 21 to 23% who have consumed in the last 6 months. The acceptors are between 32% and 38% of the population, and the rejectors in Canada are significantly higher, interestingly, 47% versus 39% in the United States. So we're beginning to develop a picture of who these consumers are. You've got the person who, I have now young friends, because I'm one of the really old guys in this industry, young friends who work in my company who've been bud tenders, for example, which is the person who's in the store who's dealing with the customers as they come in, by the way. I know the term bud tenders is very familiar to me, but it might not be to everybody else. And so the connoisseur is the difficult one. This is the guy who comes in who knows everything or thinks he knows everything. It's typically a male and is a real expert, kind of like Mark Blumenthal over there probably. It's like, oh my goodness. This guy is going to talk to me about genuses and strains and THC levels, and he's going to drive me crazy. Yeah. Then, of course, we have a whole different category of people, this much older, typically, percentage of the consumer base who are medically motivated. And that is also a very strong overlap with the CBD consumer as well. They typically, might have been a consumer of cannabis 50 years ago, and now they're coming back because of pain, typically, arthritis, other conditions of that type. We've actually recommended to some of our dispensary partners that you kind of need someone my age or older as a bud tender for those people, because it's hard to relate to a 20-something who's telling you, I think this is the solution for you, when they have no idea about the condition that you're dealing with. So this is an important segment of the population, and there's people going all the way up into the 90s. And then, of course, we've looked at other subcategories and ways to cut the data. Many of the consumers are very ardent outdoor enthusiasts, interestingly. Perhaps that's partly because of the prevalence of the Colorado, Washington, Oregon, California population, which is a more outdoorsy population than, say, in the East Coast, for example, or in the South. And then very different population is a recent adopter. Actually, the recent adopter is a very mainstream looking consumer who would be very much on everybody's target list for any kind of CPG product or natural product. So these different consumers present all kinds of different innovation opportunities. The cannabis industry so far hasn't really grappled very effectively with this. Up till now, it's been make a product, stick it on a shelf, and hope it sells. But they're just getting to the point of saying, now I need to start doing some target marketing and thinking about a specific subcategory of consumer that I want to compete for, that I want to be more effective with. So the dude is now really a very marginalized consumer. Sorry, Mark. But we all love the dude anyway. Yeah, so here are just a few data points about the cannabis consumers. It is a very wide normal distribution curve on all of these. So yes, I'm mentioning some averages here, but it is not a high peak on that normal distribution curve. So men and women, close to 50-50 now. As I said, years ago, it was mainly male. Average age of about 40, not the 28 that a lot of people used to think. About half of them work full-time, physically active, social, creative. These are words that they use to describe themselves. And these, by the way, are statistically significant differences from the rejectors and acceptors that I described before. The rejectors and acceptors tend to be significantly older. The rejectors are much older. Typically well over 65 for rejectors. So they're the people who aren't very well educated on this topic, have made their decision about cannabis, and frankly, they're voters now, but they're not going to matter in 10 or 20 years' time. 55% enjoy the outdoors. They are willing to spend more for quality, or at least they say they are willing to spend more for quality. They like to try new things, new products in particular, and interestingly, more satisfied with life. We did a promotion which said cannabis consumers are happy campers. They certainly rate much higher than acceptors and rejectors in those areas. So does this consumer look familiar? I think this consumer looks very familiar to anyone who's in the natural products industry. This is certainly an outdated stereotype now. Yes, consumers are interested in relaxing and getting high, but the consumption we think is quite purpose-driven. Yes, it's recreational and social, but also health and medical. And you can see here some data on preferences. People are consuming cannabis to relax and be mellow, to manage anxiety, to manage stress, to feel peaceful. Those sorts of criteria are very high on their list. But you'll also see pain quite high on the list as well. And a number of other conditions, sleep being a significant one as well. By the way, I consume occasionally. I'm living in Colorado. That's perfectly okay. I'm an entrepreneur. I've been through an aggressive growth of my business. I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about my business sometimes, but not after an edible, interestingly. It doesn't get me to sleep any quicker, but I'll sleep until 6:30 or 7 in the morning. On a Friday night or a Saturday night, that's very nice for me. So with regard to consumption methods, about 75% prefer inhalables, but remember what I said about vaporizers being driving the adoption, especially with the new consumer. About 20% prefer edibles, as I just mentioned in my case. And about 4% like topicals, prefer topicals. Now, topicals is only a very small category in dispensaries. I think it's a much more important category in the CBD hemp space in the Natural Foods channel. We'll have a look at some data on that in a moment. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about CBD and hemp. What this illustrates is that consumers are very, very confused. Very confused about CBD. Over a third of them are just plain wrong about CBD and THC. They think that there are no differences between CBD and THC. So obviously there's a significant educational process. It also means, frankly, there's going to be a lot of disappointment, you know, and there may be a bit of a bubble effect here. We've seen that with other natural products industry products where people thought it was going to solve all of their ills, and then they get disaffected when it doesn't work for them or doesn't do what they mistakenly thought it might do for them. So there is the risk that there is something of a bubble going here in terms of consumer expectations. Similarly, here, any product containing hemp will cause effects such as feeling high, relaxed, sleepy, etc. About 50% of consumers think that that's what they're going to get when they take a CBD or hemp product. So obviously, there's lots of room for education. Despite that, you know, many of them are purchasing these non-psychoactive products. But as I said, many don't really know what they're purchasing and what sort of experience to expect with it. And I think this is one of the issues, is that the term CBD has a resonance. It's an association with cannabis, which is this slightly illicit or risky thing. And if you go out calling your product whole hemp extract or hemp oil, it's a big ho-hum. That's not very interesting for most consumers compared to calling it CBD. But we all know there are significant legal risks associated with calling your product CBD. So as I said, there are some people, even in this room, who have already formed their opinion, as Mr. Blumenthal over there has already commented on how important CBD is, and if it was part of another plant, it would be considered a miracle functional food, for example. Products out in the market, these are products that are either available online or in health food stores, and I'll talk a little bit about dispensaries in a moment, but they currently carry either the hemp word on the label or CBD on the label. You can see some have gone very prominently with CBD, and some of them very low key, and then there are products like Charlotte's Web, the product that little Charlotte, remember from the TV show with Sanjay Gupta when he changed his mind about cannabis. Charlotte was taking the CW product. By the way, one of the reasons why this industry is inexorably moving towards legalization is because people like Charlotte's mum are just overwhelming. If you're a politician and you're going to try and oppose Charlotte's mum, good luck to you. Good luck at getting elected at the next election, frankly. And you can see that they have gone very conservative in removing CBD from their labeling. Some are also saying THC-free as well, perhaps to clarify the miscommunication and misunderstanding I mentioned before, or at least make a start on that. And there are a number of pet products that are pretty hot as well. So there are 3 core channels for sale of CBD and hemp products. There are dispensaries, and it varies between states as to which kind of CBD hemp products are even allowed in dispensaries. There's the general market, grocery, natural channel, drug channel, etc., and online and specialty stores. And online is a very significant part of this market, and we don't have very significant data about online volumes, for example, or branding. We've cooperated with our friends at Spins to start a process of aggregating the data and categorizing the products in a consistent manner. We both started independently looking at this data. It's a little confusing. And there are early signs of success in these natural food stores, for example. Here you can see a little display in alfalfas. This was a year ago. I went back to alfalfas last week in Boulder, and it was about the same size, and it was more or less the same, which is interesting to me because they say the products are flying off the shelves, and yet they haven't increased the display very substantially. About 10 branded hemp and CBD products in a locked case at the present time. So we're going to focus on these 2 key channels, the dispensaries, where CBD is derived from cannabis. In other words, it has more than 3% THC in it. And those are really California, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. That's where we have detailed data. And then in the natural foods channel, where it's derived from the hemp plant, less than 3%, 0.3% THC. And natural foods, as I said, is a smallish proportion, but it's a very interesting proportion. So looking at the dispensaries, you can see sales in 2017 of CBD products, and this is very hard to define, by the way. There are products that are CBD only. There are products that are high CBD, 10-to-1 ratio versus THC. There are products that are 50-50 ratio. It's hard to know what to define them as. And we've put a lot of work into trying to think what the consumer decides is most important about these products. So you're about a $500 million market in that channel, already 1,200 different brands. It's about 10% of the legal cannabis market consumption and sales. Now, in the natural foods channel, you're looking at a much smaller market so far, about a $70 million market, about 230 brands of products. But we do know that the market is a lot bigger than this, as I said before. Dispensary channel products include ingestibles, the concentrates that I mentioned, especially for vaporizers that are growing so fast, pet products, as I mentioned, and topicals, which is important in the CBD area. And that includes creams, balms, and also patches, for example. Of course, we don't really know if these products are very effective. It's all anecdotal at the present time. But research is beginning to happen. In dispensaries, you can see that among the CBD sales, inhalables are still very important. Flower, so this is high CBD flower products, which is a significant part of it, that are sold because they're high CBD and low THC and very explicitly done. You can see that ingestibles are an important part of the market as well, about 30% of the market. Concentrates, CBD doesn't have its market share in concentrates at the present time relative to THC products. And in the natural channel, of course, we're looking at tinctures, for example, very common. in the CBD area. It's hard to define some of these products. Spins has put a few of them into what it calls cannabinoids and then hemp products. And so hemp is a very dominant subcategory here. Almost 90% of them fall into the hemp subcategory. Of course, that includes products that are CBD, but they're labeled hemp rather than labeled CBD. So this is a confusing picture for us and them to work out. So of course the assortment is more mature, it's much greater in the legal dispensary channel at the present time compared to the natural foods channel. Now the dispensary channel has a bunch of advantages, and that's probably why this has happened so far. The products of course can be full spectrum, including THC. You can more aggressively, probably anyway, market CBD and other cannabinoids. And there are many other important cannabinoids that are beginning to get research, like CBN and CBG and THCA and THCV. Expect to see a lot of research coming out on these other cannabinoids over the next several years. The consumer, of course, in the dispensary is already sold on the benefits of cannabinoids. And you don't have to convince them in the same way. It's more difficult for competition to come in because of the regulatory environment, or it may be. And the regulations are relatively clear at the state level anyway. And, you know, CBD is hip and new and cool, and so are dispensaries in these markets at the present time. So in dispensaries, the CBD products get a somewhat higher price than the THC-only products or the products that are sold primarily around THC. And here you can see examples. You can see concentrates at about $41 per product. You can see the ingestibles about $23 versus mainstream ingestibles are about $19 or $20. Flour gets a small premium for CBD products. The pet products are about $36, $37 on average. This is a basket, a weighted average basket, of course. And topicals about $27. In the natural food stores, you're seeing those tinctures at around $40 typically. Of course, there's a lot of hemp-related products, a much lower price for the hemp food products, for example. Now, growth is pretty staggering, of course, and that's why so many people are very interested. We're seeing growth in the natural channel of 300 to 400%, for example. And in dispensaries, we've got quite used to growth at that sort of rate at the present time. So clearly, you know, the size of the market today is just a guide as to how big the opportunity is for the future. And here you can see a little bit of a comparison of the product forms, methods, assortments in the dispensaries, and the comparative growth from 2016 to 2017. And if you look at the hemp-based products, of course, from spins, you'll see a massive array of products that are including CBD or they're featuring CBD. And so it is a confusing environment to look at. It seems to be the sort of magic ingredient to put into your products in order to differentiate your products from your competition at the present time. Whether or not CBD is effective in these formats in any way is another question. It's a good marketing story at the present time, I think. So very quickly on the supply chain, Marielle will talk much more clearly about this than me, but it has been difficult to source hemp CBD products. There are not a vast array of sophisticated producers. These are the kind of products that are now available. Marielle's actually involved in creating an association around these products and a set of standards for these products, which is very exciting because it is a maverick environment. It's a lot of people who have grown up in the cannabis industry, may have been very successful in cannabis, but don't know that much about regulatory standards, GMP processes, etc. But you can find these products these are mainly available in Colorado on a wholesale basis. And there will be many, many, many more companies coming online. There is a huge wave of investment into creating CBD extracts at the present time, and of course in growing mainly outdoors now hemp product in states like Colorado. So legal cannabis is a game changer for many industries. We now not only work with cannabis companies, but we work with beverage alcohol companies who are very interested in this cannabis consumer and whether their consumption of cannabis is in some way impacting their consumption of alcohol. Pharmaceutical companies are also concerned about this. You hear a lot about the benefits of cannabis now in addressing opioid addiction, but in our survey data, we've also seen many people who've said they've reduced their use of OTC pain products as well. They've reduced their use of sleep products as well significantly. So it's impacting those two industries. And the tobacco industry is also paying close attention, perhaps in part because they feel that it's synergistic and they've got some skills that should be relevant to the cannabis space. So CBD, I would say, is in its infancy, but this is a very, very fast-growing environment. So expect a rate of change that's going to be pretty staggering over the next several years, both in terms of product availability, regulation, and consumer understanding and acceptance. That consumer education really does matter. So I think that CBD and hemp is a really interesting, intersection between two industries, the big natural products industry and the so far relatively small regulated legal cannabis industry, that $10 billion industry. I think it's an interesting intersection and opportunity. When I first got into the cannabis space, and by the way, I looked at it hard 5.5 years ago, and I decided it was way too dangerous and risky at that time, and I met some very shady characters, and I thought, I don't want to be in business with these people. I went back to it 2 years later because Patrick insisted, and because Patrick had by then got the Business Accelerator established, and I found it a very transformed space. And the people in Colorado that I've got to know are just straightforward business people, just like anyone in this room. That's not quite the case in California. California has had an industry for a long time that grew out of the counterculture movement, and there are less business transplants in California, but it is changing rapidly in California as well. But Colorado had no real endemic industry, so it's really been created by business people like us. So this could be the way it emerges. This cannabis industry is growing very rapidly. The bubble's going to be nearly as big. I don't know how big the natural products industry is anymore. I used to know all that stuff, but you're much smarter about it than I am now. And we could be going on parallel and independent paths. But one thing you can be sure of is that the pharmaceutical, alcohol, tobacco, and even CPG industries are looking very, very closely at the cannabis industry and already making inroads into this space. Constellation Brands, a very large $6 billion beverage alcohol company, has already made a $200 million investment into one of the major players in Canada and is heavily involved in the growth of that business called Canopy Growth in Canada. Something for you to bear in mind is that because of Canada's federally legal environment, huge amounts of funds have flowed into public Canadian entities. I mean, billions and billions of dollars flowing into that market, and some of that is rippling over into the United States in one way or another. So you can be sure those people are acting. This is BDS Analytics, and if you'd like to reach out to us for more information, to learn more about the opportunity, learn more about the consumer, learn more about product trends in this space, please reach out to Jessica Lucas, who joined us after 9 years at Nielsen, doing a terrific job with us, or reach out to me directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, very much. I think for all of us, we can all agree that never in our lifetimes did we think that we in the natural foods industry would be sitting here spending this kind of time talking about this, let alone the fact that it's legal, where it is, and the business opportunity that it represents. But here we are. So we have some time for some questions. Who's got questions for Roy? Hank, we will start with you.
Thanks, Roy. That was a fascinating presentation. I'm also a fellow Coloradan, so I'm familiar with the market there. When you talked about your concerns about what the character of the industry was like a number of years ago when you first looked at it as to how it's changed, I'm wondering if there is still a concern with, this was an illegal industry at one time, and there were people associated with legal activity in the industry. When you characterize Colorado sort of entirely free from that, it seems like the DEA doesn't necessarily agree. There was that bust last year with people growing pot in Colorado for sale across state lines. Among business people like yourself, is there still a concern that there is some illegal portion of the industry, maybe money getting laundered through legal cannabis activities here in the United States?
Oh yeah, that is definitely a concern. I highlighted Colorado because it's quite different from California, for example. California has a massive cultivation industry. There are Gulf Streams leaving California every day filled with cannabis. California is going to be a very troubling environment over the next several years as the legal and regulated market takes market share away from those people who've been making a living with cannabis for 30 or 40 years. Colorado, in every industry, there are going to be some shady operators. Yes, it's absolutely true that if you've got 10 years of cultivation expertise, and I know a number of people who do, then a significant amount of that was done while it was illegal, of course. But the regulators in Colorado are very impressive to me. Of course, it's the state. The state doesn't have access to the FDA or the FTC or any of those resources. So you have a bunch of lawyers, very well-meaning lawyers, trying to implement the will of the people who voted for this, trying to figure out things like which pesticides are or are not acceptable in these products, which organic nutrients, etc. And they can't turn to the FDA for help with that sort of thing. So they say, what, I'm a lawyer, now I'm supposed to be a chemist as well. Of course, they turn for advice to other people in the field, but they're doing a very conscientious job. It is a challenge that every state has different rules. This is a state-by-state industry. No product can cross state borders, and most businesses can't either in any significant way other than through licensing or some other brand association or partnership. And as Frank said earlier, banking, well, most of our clients, actually all of our clients, have come up with some way to have banking and to be able to pay. But it's a very troubling environment where people are still driving around with a suitcase full of cash in the trunk of their car. I think the regulators will do something about that over the next couple of years to take away a lot of danger from the space. Because whenever you have cash flowing around, you have temptation and you have danger. Well, there are a lot of questions. Good. Fabulous.
Hi. Since you spoke about the two markets separately, and then you were saying that they are intersecting between the dispensaries and the natural product retailers.
Yeah.
Not the retailers, that the market is intersecting. And obviously the consumer demo is very similar. Do you see natural product retailers becoming dispensaries?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of anyone who is doing that, no.
I'm in New Jersey, so I'm not in a... if they say soon, but...
That's right, yeah. No, New Jersey might be very rapid when it happens, yeah. No, I haven't really heard of any natural food chains or even individual stores that are saying, okay, I'm going to be a dispensary. Dispensaries are unique. That's all they do is sell cannabis products. Now, we are seeing that in Canada. In fact, we're seeing some of the major retailers like Loblaws saying that they are going to be dispensaries in a few of the provinces where they're going to be allowed to be dispensaries. We're seeing major chains of pharmacies saying that they also are going to be selling cannabis.
Thank you.
Bob Atwell with Marsh. Thank you for your thoughts here this morning, Roy.
Thank you.
I'll start with never tried, don't understand. We'll certainly be looking and trying to figure this out. I was drawn to a characterization. Oh, there you go.
That's CBD product.
There you go. Maybe I'll mellow my question now, yes?
It's a breath freshener as
Yeah.
well.
I was drawn to two words that you used: anecdotal ineffectiveness. Where yesterday my colleague Tracy Belt shared stories about risk, and when something is so well promoted, and yet is only anecdotally mentioned, one of the risk elements that I begin to be concerned about is: are there plausible class action events on the horizon for businesses that are marketing and selling, and you now have enormous populations who are not receiving the benefits they thought they would be receiving, and they move against not only the firm, but the boards of directors, someone like yourself who sits on a board. Could you talk a little bit about the plausible emerging risk associated with this business sector?
Yeah, so the first thing I think about there is safety of products. I just described that story of my investor who took 3 edibles and was quite sick. Nothing more than that. The first, and of course, and I'm wary of straying from my own area of expertise, but I have not heard of any proven case of anybody dying because they took cannabis. There have been a few examples of people who jumped off balconies of buildings and they were high, but they were also drunk, typically, at the same time. And so the first one is the risk that people are actually going to have serious health consequences of consuming these products. There doesn't seem to be much data to say that cannabis is dangerous. That said, you know, anything in the wrong circumstance, in the wrong hand of a person that's sensitive for some reason could be a danger, and therefore a danger of being sued. The other one there is edible consumption, which for a while a number of the companies were somewhat opposed to the labeling requirements that have been instituted in the main states and the 10 milligram maximum and all of that sort of stuff. Most of the operators are now wise enough to say this is good. It's good for the consumer and it's good for us as well. That it says 10 milligrams THC on the label, and that there are promotional efforts out there saying things like start low and go slow. If you're trying this for the first time, only take 1, you know, and the 2.5 milligram microdosing options. And then I think the other thing is that with the growth of vaporizers, a vaporizer is a way to try a tiny amount of something and to try it, you know, 1 puff and see what happens. And you get a fairly immediate response to it. So this is how the newbie is becoming more accustomed to the effects of THC. Kind of in the same way that we all learn about alcohol. When you're 21 in America, but when you're about 16 when I grew up.
So yeah, I think this is so interesting in your comments about the Colorado market. I think that, you know, many of us here in the natural products world are even confounded by this, even though we know the regulations, right? And as Stephen Daniels mentioned yesterday, you know, the FDA's position is clear on this. So when you're talking about these, you know, products being sold in alfalfas, for example, I went to Boulder, I know alfalfas. My understanding, even in Colorado, is that these products might be legal in the cannabis market, but they're really not legally sold in grocery stores, correct? So
Actually, quite a lot of the products are not legal in dispensaries. So if they come from hemp, you're not allowed to sell them in a dispensary, which is weird as well.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, maybe you could speak a little more to that. And I guess, you know, I worked with the United States Pharmacopoeia's medical cannabis panel. I think Ickles is here. He was the chair of that panel. What the understanding is that the difference between hemp and cannabis or medical cannabis is really defined chemically, right, by the amount of THC. And so maybe could you just speak a little bit to that? I think a lot of people are so confounded by this, and how is this even possible that this could be in a grocery store? So like, just for example, a friend of mine asked me, hey, do you have a recommendation for a CBD product that you know is high quality? And he takes a picture of one that he finds in his local grocery store in California. So what do? I go on the company's website. I see that they're selling a 99% CBD isolate product is the first thing marketed on their website. I'm like, red flags, red flags. Mm-hmm. I ended up calling the company, and the gentleman at the company was fairly knowledgeable. He made very sure, so obviously there's been some legal input, right, into his company. He made very sure to tell me that this was hemp and not cannabis. Mm-hmm. And they grow the hemp, and I go, oh, so you're getting your 99% CBD isolate from hemp stock? And he goes, oh no, we use the flowering tops. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? So there's been some legal input there, yet even the people at the company are confounded. I'm just wondering if this is something that you see, or in your kind of, in the Colorado market specifically with...
Oh yeah, it's an area of great uncertainty. I knew the CMO at CW Botanicals very well, and he was involved in removing all of the CBD language from their websites and making sure that they didn't have claims on their website, with sensible legal advice. But of course, there are so many fly-by-night operators. This kind of reminds me of the natural products industry 20 years ago, who, they got a garage, and before you know it, they've got a product and it says CBD oil and it will solve your cancer problems, And so there is a lot of that ignorant risk-taking, and some moderately informed risk-taking as well. Clearly, to the larger companies as represented here, there is significant risk associated with this, but there's also a significant opportunity, and the risk can be mitigated by doing smart things in your marketing and in your regulatory processing, in your sourcing and supply chain and all the rest of it. The fact is, I think that it's inexorable. The law will change, and that's the biggest risk mitigator there is. The law will change with regard to the Mitch McConnell's Act, almost certainly, because there's not going to be much opposition to that with regard to hemp and CBD, and the law will change with regard to cannabis at the federal level eventually. In the meantime, the risk within states is pretty low these days. But I was shocked when I came into the industry and I looked at those claims on people's websites, having come from Renew Life, where we had been very conservative over the years. It was just scary.
Any other questions for Roy? Okay, Hank?
So one more, Roy. Among all those branded products that you're tracking, do you have any data around which ones are sold with the word dietary supplement or supplement on the labels?
Not really data, no. We can't consistently track that. We do see that on some of the labels, as you do as well. Not so much, not in the dispensaries, but you do see it on the products that are sold in other channels. But no, I can't tell you what percentage.
Just an addition, if McConnell's bill on hemp farming gets included in the farm bill that has to be passed this year, that will be the game changer around the hemp side of business. And indications are it's possible that will happen. So we will
I think it's
likely.
Believed to be very likely, yes. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
Let's face it, the Republicans are now embracing cannabis, interestingly. Actually, it's never really been a party political issue, I don't think. Democrats have been a little bit more progressive on the topic, but not that much, really. When we look at the data, and it says, 60 or 70% are in favor of legal marijuana, if you look at the Republicans versus Democrats, only about 10 points difference.
Okay, any final question for Roy? No? All righty. Roy, thank you so much.
I'm released. Thank you.